campus itself. We go back all the time for picnic day and whatever else. And I absolutely love it now.
Thank
Beautiful.
you.
So with that, I think we need to transition to the questions from the audience. And so again, in the chat, you should find a link to submit your questions, but we have some questions that have already been posted. And so one of the questions goes back to the points about barrel toasting. And this is from Jill, who said, what difference would you expect with different toasting of barrels, say medium versus medium plus, and what flavors do those barrels specifically give to the wine?
So there's a few answers to that, to be honest, because some coopers are known based on the forest that they're selecting from. They're sort of known to have very baking spice dominated barrels, and so very vanilla, nutmeg, maybe a little cinnamon based. There are other coopers, and it really doesn't matter the toast. There are other coopers who the barrels have more of a mocha characteristic. There are some coopers that get like a whiskey lactone. And I say that in all positivity. When you think of like whiskey in your wine, that sounds odd, but these whiskey lactones have almost like a sort of like a caramelly note. And so different coopers kind of have these different profiles, and you will get impactful profile sooner with a higher toast. So we use medium, but we also use a medium plus toast because we need that impact to happen sooner, because we want to barrel these wines in August before the next harvest. For certain things that we're aging longer, because we do some Syrah, we do some Merlot, we do a tiny bit of Cab, we'll change these profiles because they're going to be in oak longer and they have a longer time for that impact to come out. But as I mentioned before, for Pinot Noir especially, those medium barrels need more time to really integrate with the wine. And so it's not something where you see that impact on a timeline that works for us a lot for some wines. And so you're thinking of all those different things as you put them together. The other thing that you're looking at is we work with some barrel coopers that do like water bent staves. And so these staves that you have on a barrel, they're bending with water. They're not necessarily bending with heat. And all these give slightly different profiles to the oak. So for certain clones of Pinot Noir that are really light, really ethereal, you don't want to crush it with heavy oak. And so we'll use these water bent stave barrels and something with a different toast versus other Pinot clones that are dark. Like some of these wines are, almost the color of Syrah sometimes. And so they're very, very dark. There's a lot of tannin, and those can handle a more impactful barrel or a heavier toast.
Terrific. Let's see. So the next question I was going to go to was from Chris, who comments on kind of all of the art here, and then asks, I'm a little surprised that all the judgments you are making seem to be subjective. Do you also make objective measurements like sugar content, pH level? I realize that art is a huge part of the process, but I thought that modern wineries also include more science for improved consistency. And so this may be something for both of you to answer.
Yeah, and I love the question because everything that I was mentioning with tasting, there are always numbers that are there. But the really strange thing with wine is you can have two wines and one can have much more acid. So let's say that the TA on one wine is a 7 and on another wine it's a 6.5, and the pHs are relative. You don't always, based on the full chemistry of the wine, taste more acid in the one that has more acid. And so some of it truly is a full snapshot of the wine that you really get from tasting. And we run numbers on everything. When we sample grapes in the vineyard, we're running pHTA. We're looking at Brix, which is a sugar measurement, which is going to end up relating to alcohol because the sugar is converted to alcohol by yeast. We look at all of that, but a lot of it will come down to what does this taste like? Because wines with different chemistries sometimes taste the same. Sometimes something with more acid tastes like it has less acid than another wine. And so it's important to not just follow the numbers from me, but to actually taste it. Do you want to add to that, Andy?
Well, what you've heard about today is what I would call artisanal winemaking, right? And what that means is there's an expert artisan who's making the critical decisions that affect the quality of the product. You can make wine by the numbers, and some places do, but even at the largest places with making the least expensive wine, the winemaker is still tasting the wine at the end of the day to make those critical decisions. They won't be in the vineyard like Chris is tasting the grapes. They'll probably harvest by the numbers and so on. But everyone, I can't imagine any winemaker putting a wine on the shelf without having tasted it.
Yeah.
Looks like we've got time maybe for one more question, and this comes from Mike. He was commenting on the fact that you're using natural yeast, which I think is more of a tradition in Europe and less so here. And so do you ever run into problems with things like Brett?
So those are two different things. When you're fermenting with natural or native yeast, the idea would be that the flora that's in your vineyard ends up in your fermentation. And traditionally in a winery that's as old as ours, they don't normally finish the fermentation, but they'll at least get it started. And yeast add certain characteristics to wine, and they certainly add characteristics to the fermentation chemistry. If I inoculated Pinot Noir with a traditional rate that's on the bag of yeast, that wine will ferment in about 2 days at most. It's very fast and hot because everything is just taking off at the same time, and it'll ferment really quickly. I find with the native ferments, they're slower, and that slower ferment, you have more time with that juice on the skins. You're not spiking temperature, which can spike a certain tannin release, and the moderation of fermentation temperature and time, I feel, works best with our wines. We do inoculate some of the whites because a lot of the native yeasts don't love to ferment cold. And so we're fermenting some of these aromatic whites cold to hold on to those aromas and not blow these aromas out of the tank by heating them up. And so we will inoculate with some cold tolerant yeast at half rates in tank to kind of take these aromatic whites down very, very slowly and keep them cold and keep all those aromas fresh. But all these are those little decisions that you can make, and one way doesn't work for everybody. So I'm just giving you a snapshot of what we're doing.
Terrific. I think now that it's 1 o'clock, we're going to have to close up. And so I want to thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. And of course, Andy as well. This has really been terrific. And so before we sign off, I've got a couple of reminders for everybody. First, we do have some videos and additional resources on ThinkND. So please review these if you'd like to dive further into today's topics. And then in 2023, as I mentioned, we'll be continuing the Science and Business of the Spirit series with our colleagues Ken Kuno from the Notre Dame College of Science. And he will be joined by Ron Runenbaum from the class of 1996, who's also a faculty member with the Robert Mondavi Institute at UC Davis. And then, as briefly mentioned at the beginning, we'll be having 3 other series in the science and business family. There's the People's Brew, where we will explore the science and business of beer. Have Wine Glass Will Travel, where we'll travel from the world to discover the best winemaking regions. And then the status of the industry, wine, spirits, and beer, examining the cutting edge of the business side of the industry. So please do feel free to share this series with your friends. It's open to the public, and we are accepting registrations throughout the entire program, as each meeting can stand alone. So thank you again for joining with us today.
Cheers.
Cheers, everybody.